So I want to welcome everyone to GenUI's 2023 Tech Trends podcast. And today we have no shortage of fascinating new developments to cover. I'm really excited to kick it off. So the purpose of this discussion is to highlight some of the most interesting areas of change in the tech landscape coming in 2023, and to give the audience some impressions as to what this group is thinking about, predicting, and forecasting from their perspectives in the coming 12 months or more. So I'm super thrilled about the group we've brought together to offer their perspectives today. And so let's just do a quick round of introductions. Joining us, we have Nico Westerdale. He's a seasoned CTO and the founder of acceleratorcto.com. Nico, could you just say a word of introduction?
Sure. Apart from being professionally provocative on LinkedIn for a living, I run a small group of CTOs, technical leaders, advisors, mentors, product leaders for small and emerging and sometimes even quite big startups.
Yeah, and you're definitely provocative on LinkedIn. I noticed that recently. So thank you, Nico. We also have Wes Vance, a staff engineer and technology practice champion at GenUI, also the founder of an app called Explore Here. Wes, maybe you could tell us about yourself and about that app.
Yeah, exactly. I've spent 8 years of my career consulting so far, and I also do build Explore Here, which highlights local history around you through 180,000 historical markers and interpretive signs. It's available on the app stores, both iOS and Android.
All right, thank you. And with us is Scott White.
We actually power a fairly large percentage of online e-commerce on the web. And I run the shopper side of that.
Thanks, Scott. Next to Scott is Jared Cheshire, the founder and CEO at Pluto VR.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jared Cheshire. I'm one of the co-founders of Pluto VR. Our purpose is to help humanity transcend physical location. We've been working on a product called Pluto Sphere that allows you to be able to run really high-end applications on lower-end hardware for augmented and virtual reality, and we're working on an operating system for XR.
Thanks, Jared. And next to Jared is Shane Delamore. He's our CTO at GenUI.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shane, and I'm sort of an entrepreneur engineer. And in a former life, I did the startup called Amy Kimmy and had a fun time doing that, and worked with GenUI in the early days of the company. And now CTO here, and one of my personal passions is programmer productivity. And I like to write programming languages and then figure out how to make us get things done faster. And of course, that's a really interesting time to be discussing that.
Thank you, Shane. And I'm Jason Thain. I'm the co-founder at GenUI, and I have the distinct pleasure of being surrounded with this illustrious group, really exciting people. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation today about a number of topics. And the one I want to kick it off with, the really hot topic of discussion today, is definitely artificial intelligence and machine learning, AI/ML, we'll say. As there's been a lot of really mind-blowing examples online of what generative networks and large language models are capable of. So we're seeing incredible creations of Stable Diffusion and DALL-E, and not only like fascinating conversations, but credible seeming code written by ChatGPT these days. So the big question is, what effect is this capability going to have on human creativity and productivity? And the provocative statement that I want to turn over to the group is, if we tend to believe that software is eating the world, is AI now eating software? So hot takes on that.
Is AI the apex predator here?
Yeah, maybe the top of the food chain, right? What is your experience so far with some of these technologies, and how might it affect all of our work?
I would say it's an inevitability. If you look over the next 20, 50 years, what percentage of software is written by AI? I mean, it's going to go up, and it's going to go up exponentially. It could be slow at first, but to me, it's not necessarily AI writing software by itself, writing in concert with human beings. But I'm already hearing from developers from people in my network, they're seeing a 20 to 100% productivity increase using a combination of GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT, and other tools. And so if they're already seeing that productivity bump, imagine what they're likely to see over the coming years. I think right now what you're seeing is primarily simple functions being generated, especially like boilerplate code, very simple static websites. But I think the complexity of the software that you'll see written is going to go up. I think the key challenge there is there's a lot of degrees of freedom when you're designing software. So with a short AI prompt is not enough detail to define the requirements for software. So that's where you need humans to kind of guide the software in terms of pinning down those degrees of freedom and actually figuring out, okay, what are we trying to build and where can AI fit into the SDLC for software development?
Yeah, degrees of freedom. That's a really fascinating way to talk about it. Like the human role is still to constrain what the ML is doing and to really align it with our needs. I know, Wes, that you've got some hands-on experience with this stuff. How would you characterize it?
Yeah, this stuff has fascinated me since it came out. I mean, really, since I was a senior in college, I built a training model on my heartbeat data using a Fitbit and built a model to predict what I was doing just based off of my heartbeat signal, right, over a given time. That was using simple classification at the time, right? It's come a long way in like just, what's it been, 8 years, 9 years, right? A decade or so. And so now like AI ML is like getting baked into all of the products we're using, right? Like what we've been talking about, the iPhone. When you take a photo, it's running, a dozen or so neural nets under the hood, right? Just like every single time you take a photo, and so this stuff is just going to continue to grow and just be part of, I think, our everyday life. It's just going to be the new way you people interact with computing, and a new way that computing is going to assist developers, artists, creatives, a lot of things. It's the robots came for the manufacturing job. This is it coming for the creative side, I think, a little bit, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's going to allow us to work on other problems and work on things that it isn't capable of helping with per se. So I'm optimistic about the future, I think, with it all. I know Chat GPT 3.5 came out. That's what was released by OpenAI, just 2 weeks ago, and it's generating like incredible content. It's exploding the internet right now. And they're working on GPT-4, which like quadruples or 10x's the number of tokens input. It's like something like 120 trillion tokens in that model that's been trained. So I think we're going to see this exponential growth and all of that very soon.
I think there's an interesting question there of what, as we look at this, and right now, like it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. What is it going to do? It's going to take over the world. But I think it's also useful to think about what the limitations are. And I mean, we've got a verbal interaction model, a textual model to interact with these models to get things back out of it. So I think as a thought experiment, it's useful to think about you sitting in Star Trek: The Next Generation, talking to the computer on the holodeck, telling the computer what to put in the holodeck. That's kind of what we're getting to, right? And you're not going to be able to prompt and say, build me the next Google, please. Like that's not sufficient information, right? You're going to have a conversation with it around that, and you're going to have to guide it a lot down that path in terms of what it's going to create. But then you can start envisioning what's that conversation going to look like? How are you going to say, I need a presence out in the world. I need a website. I need to have some apps. I need to be interactive. It's almost this checklist we've been trying to build up for new clients at GenUI. Like, what's the things you go through and ask someone on a project to get it into the ballpark? I think that's the right way to sort of thinking about where this is going to go and where this is going to take us.
So if the fear is that these machines are going to take away the programming jobs, I guess the question is the increased productivity simply going to lead to more opportunities for software development and innovation and creation? That historically has been the case. The more capability that we've added to developers and creators in tech, the more work there is to do. Will that continue, or do we think it's going to actually impact the software developer landscape?
I think it's really interesting to think about it as like an input modality, and similar to the way that you might use the web as a resource to be able to get some idea of what you want to get out of your head and like onto the screen. You can start to use these tools as an input modality to like give you something to start from. Instead of starting from zero, you can start from a generated piece of content from whatever tool you want to use. And in a lot of ways, a lot of people use the web as a starting point, and in some ways, you can start to use like these other tools. Whether you're a creative artist or you're writing software, you can start from something, even if it's completely off base. It can be a good jumping off point.
Definitely. And, there's news that this week that Adobe is going to begin selling AI generated stock content And so, we're going to see this abundance of content that can be used as that jumping off point or as inspiration for further creative work. And one of the questions that comes up is that if AI has generated content, what does that do to copyright? Because some would contend that copyright requires a human author. And I think that's a legal question that's probably going to be debated. But really the question that's behind that is, does machine learning simply create derivative works, right? So if the works that the model was trained on, then just become works that the output is derived from, do we inherit some of the copyright from those trained works? So that's a question I can't answer, but it's going to be pretty interesting.
I'm not an expert lawyer on this topic, but I think it will be similar to what we saw in the music industry, only that some of the actors that have all the data that are driving a lot of this are a little bit more conscientious than Napster or some of those services were about respecting some of the artists, although it's still, I'm sure, causing a lot of disruption and anger amongst artists. I mean, you're seeing that already. But I think it's going to be messy, and it's going to take years to work its way through the courts, and there will be some sort of middle ground set of understandings and negotiations that were worked through. But you're already seeing sites protecting themselves, telling robot crawlers not to crawl certain types of content. So there's gonna be a lot more focus on protecting the content that you don't want crawled, because there's the inputs and the outputs, right? There's controlling what is going into training the AI, and then there's controlling what's fair use for what the AI is generating.
Mhm.
And so I think when you get into the weeds on both of those, there's a lot of nuance and complexity.
So Nico,
I was going to say, to follow up on that, like to give a concrete example, we saw Stable Diffusion release version 1.5 about 2 months ago or so, right? And they just released version 2. And what they did was they removed a lot of the tokens for specific names of artists, right? It actually produced worse outputs, but to protect themselves, their business, and their model. And so now they're going back and trying to figure out, okay, how do we get back to the same results that we were getting with 1.5 without needing those exact tokens, without needing those exact artist names in there? So a little bit more of a concrete example there as well. So it's definitely happening, and companies are trying to figure out how to navigate the legal question here.
I was going to ask Nico if you thought you could create even any more provocative LinkedIn posts using GPT.
Actually, I tried, and it was a complete flop. I really did actually, and it just wasn't funny. I also tried running it through. I write children's stories for my 11-year-old son, so I fed the algorithm with one of my children's stories I've written down. And it just wasn't funny. And I think that's the problem that these models have. I'm less excited about them. I think they're useful. They're useful, for writing prompts, for I don't know how to start this essay, all right, what's the AI have to say? It's useful for fixing problems in a box. Like I have this defined computational or logic problem that needs to be written in code. Tell me the answer, that's fine. But the deep context, I think, is actually further away than we realize. My father lectures in genetic algorithms, has done since the 60s, has been working on this, retired now. He thought they'd have this all fixed by now, and we'd be, have your plastic pal is fun to be with. It doesn't exist. I think people are looking at, ChatGPT, which is great fun, and we're all playing with it, and thinking, oh, what if? But being able to seed it within the right amount of context to actually make decisions, I think, is incredibly hard to do.
So you're not ready to write off the human race quite yet.
And you can throw compute at the problem, but that's not really solving the problem of, we're sitting in a room and there is so much that we're gathering that's not just compute. It goes back to Jason. We, known each other for decades. I'm drawing on that. And how do you train a model on that? I have no idea.
I agree with some of that, but I would also disagree. I mean, I wonder how much of these training sets include stand-up comedy in there. I think if you built a training set with Dave Chappelle, every joke he's ever told, and every comedian on the planet, that it probably could generate humor. It probably just hasn't been focused on that. I think that hasn't been tested yet. That's an unknown. That's a good barometer, though, of human intelligence, because it takes a lot of intelligence to be funny. But I actually think that ChatGPT is a huge milestone for AI. I think anyone who plays with it for 10 hours and reads examples on Reddit and Twitter and YouTube and so forth would spend 10 hours with it and try not to be blown away by it. I mean, there are MBA professors generating entire courses and outlines with ChatGPT. There are people who are designing entire diets and recipes with ChatGPT. ChatGPT has actually proven a mathematical theorem as far as, I've seen a mathematician say that, whether I haven't seen another mathematician validate that. So that one's a little bit more speculative, but when you're interacting with it, it feels like you're interacting with a college professor who is well trained on a bunch of different disciplines, but is somewhat naive and wrong a lot of the time. But when you're interacting with this, it's light years beyond what we had even a year or 2 years ago.
Feels a little bit like talking to Lieutenant Commander Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation. I mean, he's very forthright and knowledgeable and pleasant, but sometimes very like wrong or foolish or just sort of naive. I've noticed that, but also like I asked it for relationship advice on behalf of a friend of mine who will remain anonymous, but it gave extremely good advice, like really, really good advice. And I sort of went, wow, that's what I would have said if I had gotten there. So, one of my further questions is just like, will we see rapid acceleration of certain types of creative work? Maybe if we're not ready to have Copilot write all the code for us. One of the questions in my mind was about 3D model generation for use in AR and VR. Right now, we have asset stores. We have, deep catalogs that we can go draw on for assets. But how long until we're just asking, a generative model for, 3D assets to go into our games and other VR experiences? Have you seen any of that happen yet?
Yeah, I've seen a couple different tech demos where people will don a headset and they'll describe, put me in a green field, and then they'll be on a green field and I'd like to see a church on the horizon. And this demo has been done a couple of different times by several different companies, but the input information that goes into the system is still really limited compared to the amount of 2D content that's just available all over the web. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the biggest opportunities that exists to bolster the capabilities of these different AIs is being able to make those make 3D content more accessible for everybody. So there's some standards that are coming out like GLTF and USDZ that describe 3D scenes and allow for 3D information to start to be an input for these systems. And I think that's going to be really interesting. The other really interesting thing that I could imagine is being able to have a translation between 2D things from a 2D perspective that then turns things into 3D, mm-hmm. which I haven't seen quite yet. But I've been seeing this trend of people creating, digital versions of themselves, like artwork that's all over social media at the moment. But I haven't seen so many 3D outputs, because that's the thing I think it would be the most interesting is give me a really sweet, accurate likeness of myself that's 3D so I could use it as an avatar. And so I think that'll be really interesting, but there's just not that much 3D data available as an input for these systems. So
you can imagine that, with enough 2D content and technologies like neural radiance fields, you can create 3D scenes and objects. And boy, I want to use that VR experience where I can just summon anything with voice. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Definitely.
So, but then we suddenly get into this territory of prompt engineering, right? So we as humans have to learn how to interact with these things in the most effective way. And if anybody who's tried it, I think you realize that there's actually quite a hill to climb there.
Just go ahead, Shane. Thinking just a thought experiment. It is very much in a sense like magic, in the sense it's an incantation, right? And it's an incantation that's not quite English, and it almost feels like you're saying a spell in order to get something out of this system.
It reminds me of the days when Google came out, or the first search engine, and people were trying to figure out how do I find the right web page for myself, right? We didn't type it in English. It was key terms that we had to figure out how to put it into the search engine, right? And get the right page for our search. It's essentially a different mapping, but the same problem or the same struggle here.
And it's like Nico was talking earlier about that context, about a long-term relationship, right? I think that's one of the things that's going to make it more accessible is if you get to the point where the system can interact with you over a long period of time and then learn how you talk and how your speech patterns and your assumptions and so forth, so that you can say show me a picture of dolls from the 1940s. That maybe will get you some results now, but maybe with the context of what you're interested in, what you are as a person, they can fill in those gaps of those details of the prompt so that you can actually get the output that you would like without having to do all these sort of incantations.
Yeah,
There's definitely a Black Mirror episode on that too. So
like most things. I think there's, in where this goes though, right, is to something really interesting where we're all having this podcast and there's an AI sitting there having the conversation, right? That's the fun stuff. But I think there's something baked in about this where the technology has no physical presence and no mortality. So therefore will, once it gets there, right, obviously we're a ways off, right? But it doesn't have the same perception of the universe that we do. It doesn't have it's not born, it doesn't grow up, it doesn't have children, it doesn't die. So through that lens, you could fake it up. So maybe it would, and that might be interesting, but it's always going to perceive things from a very different viewpoint. It's also going to be programmed in the same way. There's no different races. You could, again, seed it with different things, but at its core, it's working in the same way each time. Whereas, humans are very spongy and work in different ways. I think there's limitations in that. I don't know how to get over that. Maybe you have different thoughts there. But...
So do we think that next year on the Tech Predictions podcast for 2024, we'll have, a large language model sitting here answering questions with us?
We could do that right now with ChatGPT pretty much.
We could, but maybe next year it'll be even better. So I want to shift gears a little bit. So it's like really clear that AI ML is going to be woven through all aspects of technology and software development in both the near and the far future. So I want to turn to the topic of AR, VR, and spatial computing. There are a lot of rumors right now around an Apple headset maybe coming in 2023. Some people think definitely, some people think definitely not. But we also have the Meta Quest Pro kind of as the leading headset model at the moment. And, I think maybe Zuckerberg these days gets kind of a bad rap, but I did see something I agreed with this that's, for better, for worse, Meta is dumping billions of dollars into hard tech R&D to level up AR and VR. I don't know if you have a perspective, Jared, on what's happening with either Meta or Apple or other hardware.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how many AR features are already in mobile devices that Apple produces. There's a lot of different tools that are able to be used to make AR and VR content to capture the world. Like the latest iPhone has the depth sensors. It allows you to do face tracking. These different components are the same components that exist in augmented and virtual reality headsets as well. And so I can just imagine a device coming out at the right time, but the speculation is high. I'm really excited about the idea of a wearable device from Apple. I think it would start a hype train around AR and VR that would be really cool to see the augmented reality marketplace start to really take off. And then there's companies like Meta that are pouring tens of billions of dollars into the ecosystem. And there's a bunch of different companies that are starting to enter the market this year. So my prediction for this year is there's going to be a bunch of new devices that come to market that are going to be competitive to the Quest devices that'll start to allow a more open ecosystem. And that's something I'm really excited about.
And I happen to know that a large part of your work has to do at Pluto and OpenXR has to do with creating interoperability standards so these devices can talk to one another. If we're really going to create a metaverse, we have to have the ability for all of the devices to coexist in the same sort of shared space. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that frontier and what's happening new with that standards body work.
Yeah, definitely. So OpenXR is a set of standards that allows you to be able to target one platform and have it run on many different devices. And this year, there's many different devices that are likely to come out. And instead of having to create a separate application that targets, each one of the devices, which is how it's been for a long time. If you wanted to create an app and get it to all the different devices, you'd have to create one app for an HTC device and one app for the Meta device and another one for a Lenovo device. Now you can just make one application and get it out because of OpenXR. There's also another standard called WebXR that allows you to create web applications that can target these devices as well. So the overhead for developers to be able to target a lot more different devices is much lower than it's ever been. And that work took a long time to get there because everyone had their own kind of way of doing things. So getting everyone to have consensus around like how to render took quite a while. But now that that's out and available, it makes the threshold for creating augmented and virtual reality content a lot lower.
Is Apple going to play with that standard, or are they going to
Do their own?
Create their own.
So Apple's pretty involved in the WebXR standard.
Uh-huh.
I think there's even a preview of like WebXR on iOS devices. So I think they'll play well in the world of the web, but it's highly unlikely that they would produce something that's compatible with OpenXR. I imagine it's going to be like Vulkan versus like Metal type of situation.
Mm-hmm.
So do those standards speak to just the codecs, the streaming, the technical implementations of all that stuff, or are they actually relevant to the geometry of the shared environment and how things are going to coexist and translate between one set of coordinates or coordinate space to somebody else's?
Yeah, so OpenXR, the first set of kind of things that it was meant to accomplish is getting the baseline set of APIs that are needed to get an application like rendering and speaking to hardware. And so now that that's out and available, you can have one app that is able to run on many different devices, but the world understanding that exists is relatively limited. It's not quite to the point where you can do all the different augmented reality use cases. You can produce a VR app that has very minimal, if no changes, that can run on several different devices, but it essentially knows where it is in 3D space. It can have like 6DoF tracking and input. Things like augmented reality require a lot more information about the world. Those are starting to be defined and will be implemented as extensions that then can be part of the core specification. So you can start to do things like get geometry about the world. So that'll take a little bit more time to get implemented, but we're still working on that standard, and it's something that you should be able to experiment with extensions and propose solutions to those problems that anyone who's contributing to the working group can add. On the WebXR side of things, there are some other standards that exist, like one level up, like 3JS, Babylon.js, A-Frame, that can do things like describe the world, a scene. And then there's standards and formats like USDZ and GLTF that allow for like interoperability and models to get transported from like one application to another. So maybe you scan something with your phone and then upload it to a VR or AR headset and you can look at it. Those types of workflows are starting to be enabled.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask the group, obviously VR gaming is super fun and VR experiences on AR is starting to be more and more relevant and widely supported. But what are some of the highest and best use cases that we're seeing today enabled with current technology? What are some of the killer apps today?
Yeah. I like Beat Saber a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just represent a GenUI. We've had a lot of incoming interest for training, basically. A lot of VR training around things that would require otherwise physical props to do the training, using particularly AR or VR to be able to do that in a way that can either have the advantage of the remote or have the advantage of not having to have as many physical props, or being able to do more extensive things. In particular, like training for like extreme situations, hospital training for extreme situations never happen in real life, but you can simulate it in AR, VR. We're seeing a lot of interest in that lately. And I've also seen another interesting startup, which I don't remember their name, but they're overlaying building information onto construction sites. So you can validate that it's being built as per the plans. You can see does that pillar line up exactly where it's supposed to be in the plans, and have that sort of interactive on-site experience between the construction of the project and also the designs, and sort of to evidently there's, like 50% waste in building buildings because of inaccuracies. Like it's an enormous number. So there's a huge opportunity for improving that whole system.
Yeah, we've seen architectural visualizations for years, going all the way back to Rift DK1, where, if you're going to spend $50 million on a skyscraper, it might be kind of nice to walk through virtually before ground is broken and understand what it looks like.
Jason, you and I are doing avalanche rescue training tomorrow. It'd be great to do that in a VR space.
It'd be a lot warmer.
Yeah, that's true. Save some of the commute
Less
over to
driving.
Snoqualmie. But it seems like producing the content is a key bottleneck. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually not a subject matter in this area, but I would have to speculate that AI hopefully can help with some of the content generation, and maybe leave more of the design and vision and sort of shaping of that content to humans. But what do you think? Is that something that you think might be achieved in the next 5 years with AI helping to generate some of the content?
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the more and more 3D content being made available. So just like scans of the world, photogrammetry models of the world, all of that is able to be utilized to be able to be part of that kind of data set that could be remixed and produced to be able to have something to start with. But at the moment, just getting kind of an XR scene up and running, it does take a little bit of finesse, and getting like a development environment to create XR software takes a little bit more effort than it would typically take if you're creating a 2D application. So I think that's where some of the biggest opportunities are to like get up and running, is just making some of these things more accessible for folks. Like the WebXR, for example, just allows you to be able to quickly go in and start and create a scene. And then the frameworks you want to use for being able to do that are all based on web standards. So you could get the baseline of your application implemented like with any tool that you might normally use, then start to add that immersive behavior on top of it. So I think the biggest one is like getting just everything bootstrapped. And there's already some examples out there where you can be like, make me a React 3JS app that has, a scene and the headset in it, and you can start from there.
Very
But
cool.
yeah, I think
That's
there's a lot
awesome.
of productivity benefit.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Another topic that I was interested in is the notion of if the accessibility hurdle for VR, particularly when it comes around having a dependency on having a pretty beefy local GPU, is there a way to reduce that hurdle by using pixel streaming, by using different technologies that do cloud side rendering, and then pass pixels down to the headset? What's the state of the art in that regard, and what are some of the like performance conditions currently?
We're creating a product called Plutosphere that's out in the wild. You can check out now, and it allows you to be able to have your entire experience streamed over the network from an instance that's close to you, either on the edge or on the cloud. And what that lets you do is have a lightweight device like a Quest or a Quest Pro or these AR glasses that are starting to become available, and offload all the computation of that experience, or most of it, to these resources that are thousands of watts more in power. Mm-hmm. And because the network latency is to a threshold, and the physical location of the devices are close to where people are now, that's just becoming possible now. So there's tens of thousands of people that are using this now, and allowing them to play and experience things they couldn't run on the devices that they have currently. And it's only going to get better. Like this is like the earliest kind of threshold we're able to produce that experience, and it'll only get better from here.
And is the primary performance consideration bandwidth, or is it latency, or is it both?
It's latency is the biggest, most difficult hurdle to overcome. Mm-hmm. Even if you have like a 1200 megabit connection, if you have over 50 milliseconds of latency, the amount of time it takes to like input or get a new view of the world mm-hmm. can start to make you feel uncomfortable. So yeah, latency is the key factor.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to pre-render a lot of different inputs like you do with gaming, because it's
mm-hmm.
all the different angles you could possibly move your head, right? How do you stream down that to account for that latency problem?
Yeah, there's some folks that are producing like light field formats that are essentially allow you to be able to give you a whole lot of different views and perspectives, all as like a packet of information. And that's one way you could reproject and have a really latent connection. You might be experiencing like a claymation version of the world with like stop motion animation updates, but you could move through it very smoothly.
So it feels real. You don't mm-hmm. get nauseous.
Yeah, right now it's kind of a brute force solution to the problem, where it's like if you can get low enough latency and you can get updated poses fast enough, you can have a really solid experience. But some of that reprojection method technology can totally overcome the latency requirements too. But the formats are not defined yet.
Yeah, it seems in the future, but a hybrid approach may make sense.
Mm-hmm.
We just see this trend, I think, across a lot of like areas right now, right? Like a lot of gaming is just moving towards that. Xbox is moving a lot of resources to this cloud gaming system, really dumb terminals, smart cloud, dumb terminal type thing. The future where we're all just got like really cheap tablets, disposable, because it's just streaming content right into them. And I don't know, is that my prediction is that like it is a hybrid solution, I guess, for both of those. You need kind of some local computing and the cloud computing to maybe like that's the best approach. But I'm curious what everyone else thinks. What is the trade-offs there? What is the optimal, I don't know, cloud versus local solutions?
Yeah, I think multitasking for XR is like the killer app. When people are like, what's the killer app? It's like multitasking, being able to run multiple things at the same time, having a layer of local content, maybe rendered using WebXR for things like a HUD or things you want to have be running on device that's really lightweight and easy. And then also being able to run immersive content that can be composited together, and having it either run locally or remote, I think is one way to be able to start to experiment with what works the best. And yeah, multitasking in XR is something that's like relatively new. There's not a lot of folks that are doing it. We have multitasking features we've been working on for a long time that started with our first app that was a multitasking app was just communication. So the ability to be able to hear and see people no matter what you're doing, kind of like the movie Black Panther, like when they talk to each other, they don't go somewhere new. They like just see holograms of each other in front of each other.
Yeah.
That use case is really cool, no matter what you're doing, like no matter what the immersive use case is. So yeah, having hybrid rendering is super interesting. But I think to really take advantage of it, you also have to have multitasking.
Yeah, so the day is not far off when I'll be completely surrounded by browser tabs in 360 degrees. Thank you for that, Jared. It's coming. Yeah. Great. Well, I want to shift the conversation to a discussion of web and mobile technologies and sort of the state of the art in web and mobile and like what's coming for the next year. And so, Wes, you mentioned a minute ago that in iOS, one thing we're seeing is that Apple's taking advantage of a lot of the AI cores and core ML, running a lot of neural nets concurrently when you do all sorts of things, not just taking photos, but things like spatial audio. Are you seeing, the ability for these platforms to do that more and more? Is it going to go beyond just iOS?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because like when I was growing up, right? Like the big metric was like how much memory, how much CPU power, how much storage did you have, right? And those are still important metrics today. But now we're also seeing like how many neural net cores do you have, and how much like machine learning can you do in the background, And that's kind of like a big selling point for the hardware nowadays, right? Particularly with Apple getting into their own chipsets on the M1 and all of the chips on the mobile side as well. So I just continue seeing that being more and more of a trend that I think other hardware companies are going to continue and carry on, and we're just going to be able to start seeing mathematical computations targeted and trained for machine learning to continue to be more important. I know, like Apple, for example, not to swing this all the way back to our AI discussion earlier, but they just announced that they're going to allow you to train these models on, they're going to change the software on their computer to allow it to be more efficient to training the models locally, where traditionally you would have had to put this in the cloud, where but with the M1 chips, they're going to try and bring that down so you can train these on your machines, which is something that like a lot of hardware companies I don't think can offer right now. So it's an interesting both hardware trend, as we move forward. Can you train these? I think the ultimate dream would be, can you train an avatar right off of your iPhone? We're getting there, not quite there yet, but in 3 or 4 years, you should be able to train Stable Diffusion right from your iPhone. Probably even sooner than that. So pretty kind of cool. We think about like all of these type of AI applications as like big kind of computing heavy server side things, but when you can bring it down to the actual like app level, on the actual device as well, it just makes them even more useful, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great question to track and explore. It's like, what are the use cases for actually training your own models, apart from a lot of what I'm seeing today and what I'm aware of today is just using pre-trained models, within applications. But what are the use cases for local training? And that must be a consideration if that's been one of Apple's design priorities.
Arguably, that's where the huge value is, right? I think Nico was kind of bullish on this earlier, right? Which is that like arguably being able to take your subset of data, whether that's your personal data or your business data, and have an AI understand that data in its context is where the value is. And so being able to train a model on your niche, on your subset, is the cool thing. Having a generalized AI is awesome, fun. That's what we're seeing with ChatGPT and stuff. But the real value comes in with like, hey, I understand who Nico is, I understand who Wes is, and I'm going to build models, according, that are trained kind of with us in that context and stuff. So we can be snarky on on LinkedIn and carry on there, Nico.
Well, step in there. And what you're saying about Apple, I think makes sense with Google as well. They're advertising the Pixel phone basically on its AI capabilities of being able to cut people out of photos or whatever. And Google on both Apple, as much as Apple says they don't do it, I'm sure they do it as much as Google does. They're listening to you all the time. We all carry around these devices that are getting increasingly more intrusive and watching us, training a model. They already have the data. It's just turn it on, basically. They're going to be training themselves before you know it. You turn on your phone and you click one prompt without realizing, saying, let me just monitor everything and train my AI in the background. And away you go. It's right there for the
Suddenly
take.
it's buying your groceries.
Yeah. And I'll send you a message saying, how was your trip in Thanksgiving? And my wife was surprised you got a message because you didn't tell Google that they're going on a trip. Of course it knew, right? It's already there.
It's so interesting because for, the 13 years since the iPhone App Store was first released by Apple, every year, there were, wonderful advancements in the platforms and in the APIs that were available. And, am I alone in thinking that maybe that this has plateaued a little bit and now the focus is really more on, how ML is supported by the hardware? Is that the selling point of these platforms these days? Has the rest of software development been commoditized? The reason I ask is we sort of took a poll on, what was interesting on these platforms, the mobile platforms in particular. And kind of what we got back was, well, package management is much better.
It's probably true that it's definitely flattening, but that's, my guess would be the reason Apple is trying to get into AR is to move the iPhone into your glasses. And so you're not looking at a phone all the time. There's, it's sort of happening in a more ambient way. And, and I think that itself would be a huge revolution, obviously. And that's probably what they're gearing up for, I would have to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's a sign that their focus has become, taken away from advancing, for example, iOS as just a mobile phone platform and to something else. And so, the question in my mind is, does that create an opportunity for more sort of cross-platform native wrappers, things like, React Native and Electron?
Yeah.
Well,
So like,
anything.
Go
Sorry,
ahead,
I was going to say not if
Go.
Apple has anything to do with it, because they always want to lock things down. I mean, they're not going to do any of these wonderful standards that you're talking about with with AI, AR and VR. That's their entire business model, is to own stuff.
It's interesting. I'm surprised how involved Apple's been in the WebXR initiatives and the immersive web working group and the W3C. They made significant contributions, and there's versions of that it's available in preview in Safari. So while I don't think they'll play ball on the native side of things, on the web side, I could imagine them like allowing for and taking advantage of WebXR content. I mean, you can go to the Peloton website right now and launch a view to be able to see your Peloton. It's in the browser. I think that some of the earliest use cases are going to just be looking at static models, but I think Apple's going to make a web. They're going to play ball on the website, I think.
If they're still considered an early adopter to this technology, which I think arguably they would still be considered an early adopter if they release something, this next year. It probably makes business sense for them to support an open platform, right? Because like there's just not enough content for them to own, I think, in the short term. Maybe over time they start locking it down or they optimize for specific use cases and specific hardware and things like that. But it makes sense, I think, in the short term for them. If they came in later in the game, then maybe it would, they could carve their niche out and have more of their opinionated standard. But it seems like right now, it would make sense for them to allow Safari to be able to run these type of AR VR things in the browser if they're going to release, release some type of headset. But I guess time will tell. But going back to your question too, I think right now, from a app development standpoint, I think making it really easy to build apps, like reducing the barrier to build applications, is something we're seeing just like across the board, both on the native side, on the web side, and to be honest, a lot of the apps that businesses need aren't that complex of apps, right? They're CRUD type applications, right? Create, read, update, destroy type applications. And so for the vast majority of applications like that, we can build ways easier to make them. There's always going to be the harder, more custom, more native, more performant applications that need to be made. And those tools exist, right? But lowering the barrier of entry for anyone to kind of come in and build their own, like their application, is, I think, a trend we're seeing both in native development with Swift UI, React Native, being able to kind of simplify using web technology, you can kind of target multiple platforms all around. On the flip side, I also think it's getting more powerful with technologies like WASM, WebAssembly, right? Where we're able to now start programming for the web on lower level technologies and stuff, and bring that to the web as well.
Yeah, they're like two sides of the coin, right? So using web technologies to drive native APIs is becoming more practical because the native API surface is less dynamic. It's not evolving as fast. And so we can use some of these web tools, and web developers can do more with native apps. But on the flip side, WASM, is a framework for, to transcend JavaScript for browser-based applications. Is actually doing things in native code in the browser. So those two things are happening.
I think we're going to see more pro tools be transitioned into the browser in the coming years, right? We're seeing this with Figma. Figma 5 years ago wasn't even like remotely possible before WASM, right? Their whole platform is built on WebAssembly using a C rendering system, right? And so, like, what else can we move from native desktop apps into the browser? And can we build video or audio, snipping tools in the browser? How about photo management and editing tools in the browser? I think all these type of pro tools that we've traditionally viewed as like desktop tools are going to continue moving to the browser type system.
The combination of WebAssembly and WebGPU unlocks the browser to become insane. Like, I think that's going to be a giant step function for augmented and virtual reality once WebGPU lands alongside the definitions for WebXR.
Yeah, super exciting. And it seems like that's a significant missing piece. And one thing I did want to ask about is just kind of the state of like low code and no code frameworks. So about a year ago, everybody was talking about low code, no code frameworks, and are they going to, upend the world of app development? And I wanted to reflect just on how that's gone and what sort of we think about how these frameworks are working today, particularly things like Microsoft Power Apps, Zapier, and there's a whole host of low code or no code frameworks that purport to go even farther than this use case of like using JavaScript to run native APIs. It's like okay, just drag and drop blocks and make apps, right?
Yeah, well, I'll dive in on no code, low code. I think it does what you would use Excel for. It's like taking the use cases where businesses use Excel and making it a little bit better, letting you go a little bit further down that path of I want to mock something up quick. I need to work with my business data. I need to build out solutions. But the problem I've seen with a lot of the no code, low code solutions is they don't have a graceful degradation from these sort of drag and drop things into a fully custom solution. And if your app's getting bigger and more complicated, you get to the point where they have a complexity threshold where they can't really grow a lot more. And they can be a great use for businesses that need to automate very specific business tasks and get them done. But for like an app you're going to deploy out to lots of people, if you need any type of performance control, if it is any of the scales of sizable complexity, they said they tend to not have a graceful way that you can start writing custom code in them. A lot of them don't have like just basic Git capabilities in terms of version control and merge and so forth. So it just doesn't have a lot of those things that we're used to as normal software dev for scaling larger applications.
So, I mean, I agree with you for the high complexity use cases that you wouldn't want to use that, but there's a lot of low complexity use cases that powers a lot of the economy today. So I think there's a place for it, but you need to know what the place is and where to use it.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, my question is this going to be ChatGPT's first victim? Because that seems like a perfect use for ChatGPT's next generation is replacing low code, no code, and having people who don't know how to code too much be able to I just need to connect this database over here, and when this record updates, I need to send an alert out to my boss, right? That seems like a perfect thing for ChatGPT. The one problem with ChatGPT is it's hard to say.
Yeah. So the notion that ML could advance our ability to actually use low code or no code platforms more effectively where they're not as constrained by the limitations that they are today. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen is that the low code, no code tools can end up getting just as complicated or more complicated than code, because they have to sort of do acrobatics in order to do all the things that people kind of end up wanting them to do. And so is there a way to leverage, will Salesforce or platforms like that end up leveraging ML to give people the ability to go farther with those kinds of platforms?
Yeah, at GenUI, we've seen both things. We've tried to build an app with low code and regretted it, but we've also used low code to accelerate business practices and got something done in a week that would have taken us 3 months. So it's really choosing the right match for the problem, as with all tools, right? And just realizing that there's a place for it, but it also has its limitations.
So we use, with these early stage startups that we work with, often they're sometimes coming in with a low code app, or we're saying you're not ready to go to engineering yet. Use a low code app just because of the speed of product iteration that you can do there. Right. You can just like thrash on a design, doing something that's a little bit more robust than Figma, that's actually real, that's got a MySQL database in the background if we're using Bubble, which is, I think, terrific for a lot of applications. And hey, you can get out in front of real users and actually you can even take transactions on this thing. Yeah, it's not going to be great, right? It's not going to have all the bells and whistles, but just that rapidity of development cycles, getting those down really, really fast, I think it's absolutely priceless for that.
And what a valuable way to get an entrepreneur to focus on validating the product rather than on, creating a vision in exquisite detail, which is a trap, right? You want to coach them to take the most expedient path to validation of a product hypothesis, and any stumbling you do along the way is gonna slow that down.
I don't think you can do it. I don't think AI helps you there. I don't think an ML engine helps you there. It's more about thrashing on the idea.
Nico, have you seen those type of startups that get started with low code, no code, be able to go and raise funding and get their first round of funding done just from having a low code solution, and then be able to take that funding and go build a little bit more of a robust solution?
Absolutely. I'm working with one. So they came in with seed funding off of a Bubble app.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. We've taken a few from low code, no code platform to full feature product development after they reach validation. So that's
that's awesome, right? They reduces their they don't have to spend $100,000 to get an idea validated now. They can spend $10,000 or less to get an idea validated out the door, and then come and build a sustainable company and business around that validated idea.
And I think that's an opportunity for the general people offering low code. I don't actually think low code has to have this sort of threshold where it can only go so far and then you have to rewrite it in a better platform, quote unquote. I don't think there's any reason why we can't have a more graceful transition from one into the other, but I just haven't seen it yet in the current offerings. But I think there's a huge opportunity there.
It's normally just overhead of the client. So you just look at the performance and you think, 10 seconds to start up, that's never going to fly. And how do you get off of that? It's stuck.
Yeah.
To maybe reflect though on your point, Nico, about ML and AI in the space, it seems like the ultimate sort of low code, no code experience would be to just explain verbally to an ML what you want the application to do, and then it can iterate with you. Like it gives you a version that's a simple CRUD app that stores your input in the database and allows you to delete it and update it. And then if you can explain features bit by bit, maybe eventually you can get to where a startup can just sort of like, get to first base of product validation just by explaining what they're trying to do and, validate that. The next topic up for bid is that of data and the notion that, data is the new oil, right? And so particularly with these advancements in machine learning, organizations that have a lot of data and that can access it and use it effectively are going to have a fundamental advantage against those that don't. And so there's a lot of data sitting around in data lakes, because we've known this for a while, right? We've known that that data is really important in enterprise, and the question is this data been sort of dumped in these data lakes in poorly structured and underutilized form? And so are data lakes becoming sort of like data wastelands? That's one question.
Toxic waste dumps.
Yeah. So where data goes to die, right? So it can be prized as a corporate asset, but then sort of neglected and abandoned. And what's that?
Oh, question. Has data just been dumped there because we've been waiting, just sitting, like the data's just been sitting there waiting for the right like algorithm to come in or the right tooling to come in to be able to actually just go in here, just I can point it at the lake, the data lake house and figure it out, you know? And WebGTP and these type of newer models is maybe a trajectory down that path. And like, it's kind of like we put data in cryo storage. We don't know what we need it for in the future, but we hope the future will figure it out.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit of my problem with that. The term data is the new oil just misses it just by a small mark. Data is the new shale. The oil has not been extracted yet, right? We've got this huge pile of data. Some of it's useful, some of it's not. We need the tools to be able to refine that data and get the useful information out of it, which it might be this, you know, the custom training of ChatGPT things to your data warehouse so you can extract and ask questions about it and get intelligent answers.
Or has it just been that it's been so expensive to get data out, and that's why it just sits there? It's like really difficult to turn the shale into oil right now.
Right.
Like there's not the tooling or the use cases, or you know, the big companies can do it, but like a smaller or mid-sized company, it might just be very expensive right now. And hopefully, you know, with these modern technologies, it can make it cheaper to gain these insights. And
Yeah. So you mentioned the lake house model, right? The idea that if you sort of have to write a schema, you know, at analysis time for every piece of data that's stored in the data lake, that you're never going to get around to actually doing the level of analysis that you should. And that if there's a sort of a quick and dirty way to create the right schema for the data when you encounter it, when you need it, and then keep that schema around for when you need it in the future. Those are some of the ideas that are kind of behind this lakehouse model. It's being promoted by Databricks in their commercialization of Apache Sparks. The Sparks just-in-time schemas for handling this data.
The goal is to make it, you know, low code to no code to be able to extract your data from whether it's your marketing department, your sales department, your service department, you know, your storefront. Get it into that lake house. Have unified profiles so that you know you're getting all these different customer events, but it understands across all these different systems kind of a unified profile for who your customer is. And then it's taking all the interaction data coming from, you know, different people clicking on your site and taking different actions, unifying all that data, and then sending it back out to whatever platforms and applications you want so that you can use it in a just-in-time basis to have like A/B testing, do personalization. And so it's just trying to make that end-to-end life cycle super easy. So you don't have to have teams of people writing complex ETL that goes stale within, you know, a couple of years.
Yeah. So the vision literally is that we're going to use ML to, you know, superpower the analysis process from these disparate, like unstructured or poorly structured data lakes, and save all the time that's spent in analysis today. You know, we have some keen interest within GenUI on graph databases as well, for you know, just kind of a knowledge database format that is very sort of tractable by AI and ML. So that's another key area of interest. I don't know if any others on the call are tuned into that, but something I'm tracking. It's just something we're excited about.
I think it's interesting to think about, like, how is this data actually useful? Like, we assume that there's value in this data and we're going to try to extract it, but part of it might be just we don't know, and we're going to get insights out of it, right? Yeah. So part of it's being able to explore it interactively and get information out of it. But part of it's stuff's a little more concrete. Like we know we want to better understand our customer. We don't actually understand if we're delivering the value we want to, or customer, everyone's a unique individual. And so how to make it so that they can get their particular personalized version of the value we deliver in a real-time basis. And then the other half, I think, is the cost side, right? The cost of doing business, understanding all of your costs, your supply chain, the costs of, you know, your organization, how it runs, and trying to understand where the gaps are and where the value is actually coming from, so you can, you know, focus your delivery end to minimize the costs. And within those two things, like, how are we delivering the value, and then what are our costs? And then sort of breaking our insights into those two groups. And then you can start thinking about how are we going to get our information out of there. And part of it's moving so fast, right? That's part of the problem about having a schema ahead of time. Whatever schema you have, no matter how brilliant you are, is going to be wrong tomorrow. And so you want to just capture the data, but then be able to, in real time, extract it back out of it in any which way, you know, the information leads you down that path. Like, oh, I see that we've got 20% of our customers who, you know, are abandoning our app after 1 minute of use. Like, what is going on there? And being able to have hypotheses, test them, dive in deeper. I think that's where the value is going to come from.
So if there's a tremendous amount of friction today just in accessing the data in the way that makes sense, it will block us from realizing how many other opportunities there are to make use of that data, either in analytics or in APIs or in,
we all know from the customer experience, right? You've used some product and you get like a minute in and it does something that just drives you absolutely crazy and you walk away and you're just like, I can't use this. This is stupid. And the reality is it probably was, you had to tap in the upper right corner, not the upper left-hand corner. If you would have just tapped it in the right corner, you would have been off the races and you would be getting the value out of that and you would have loved it. But we don't even know that as software developers half the time. We don't know that's the problem. And it's usually often it's like a one-line code fix. But we don't have the data to give us the information to help those 20% of customers that click left when they should have clicked right.
Yeah, I forget who said that all software, maybe it was Steve Jobs, like all software is just reducing friction, right? Mm-hmm. So the less friction that exists, the more is naturally going to happen with it. And I think this is just a special case, right, of being able to ease the friction and allow, more to happen. So thus, maybe reinforcing that idea that, the more we automate software development, the more opportunities we'll have for software development. So maybe the market for software development is going to continue to increase instead of being totally consumed by ML. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
I've got a tangential question for the group. So we're going to collect all this data on all our users. How is that going to intersect with all the data privacy stuff that's going on with California and with Europe's pushing? Like, what's it going to be like in AR, VR, when you basically have a whole 3D world that you can collect data on every single user, right? But then how does that interface with, respecting privacy and doing it in a way that doesn't lead to bad outcomes of abuse of that data? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for VR and AR, like starting with like not just collecting everything is like a good first step. So like that's kind of our approach from the get-go. We have a generalized idea about like where you go and where you are like on the web and the means in which you can like get into a flow in which you actually like connect to something. But once you're connected, that's your experience, and we're not tracking what's happening like inside of that to any degree where we've got like data lakes or anything like that. So right. I think that's a good place to start from like on the AR and VR side of things. But there is just so much information that could be gathered about your attention, where you're looking, what kind of experience you're having. And there's even like a lot of folks that have done research around like being able to identify people based on movement even. So even if you aren't able to be seen, you could identify someone based on the way that they move. So it's really interesting to think about the privacy concerns that are there, but there's a whole lot of them.
Yeah, the rule of thumb I run into with personal identified information is if there's enough bits in the data to that matches up to the number of people using it, you probably have enough bits to identify people. Mm-hmm. Like if there's 20 million people using it and you've got 22 bits of data, you probably have enough information to actually identify people with it, unless you're doing explicit, computational things intentionally to make it not identifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think broadly speaking, you could divide the corporate world into organizations that are default privacy on and default privacy off.
Right.
So the ones like Apple and Salesforce and others who are default, privacy on are basically have their hands tied behind their backs. There's a whole bunch more we could do with our customer data if we didn't have privacy issues. But because we have those issues, you have to be very cautious and selective. And there's actually just things we can't do because, we can't share data across customer boundaries in a lot of cases and things like that. Apple is taking, is very responsible on that. And that's actually, I think, why they're getting a lot of respect and their user shares is doing quite well because people want, obviously consumers want that.
Yeah, my partner switched off of Android for that one reason alone.
Yeah. So it makes the world much more complex from a machine learning standpoint because it adds a whole bunch of limitations to the way you're allowed to use the data. But I think that's the way it should be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I will I'll never underestimate the capitalism's way to get around these problems. I know Facebook a couple of years ago said they could tell where a person existed, even if they weren't on Facebook, by the hole that they left, just because it was so big. So they knew all the people. And that's a way around it, right? And if our companies are set up to find those holes and make use of them. It's just good business.
Netflix ran into this issue.
Go on.
I was just Netflix ran into this issue when they were this is a while back, right? When they were doing the the Netflix prize, right? Which was like, improve our algorithm by 10%, we'll give you $1 million or whatever, right?
Yep.
And the training data that they released was actually they were able to take, scientists were able to actually take it, find just the rows of like, I like this, don't like this, don't like this, just that, simple as that with movies, and identify those back to users, right? Super generic, there's no data associated to a person, but if you know enough about the input and you know enough about the pool, you can kind of match them again, right? And so similarly, I'm kind of curious to go like to figure out what laws, regulations, and stuff. To go off Nico's point, assuming everything's pessimistic in terms of like companies are going to continue trying to mine data, even if they're not allowed to literally track a user ID, right? Great, we scrubbed the user ID. What's the next level beyond that they're going to try and do? And is there going to be a law, a rule in the future that tries to prevent that level of it? And it's this cat and mouse game that's behind between the laws and what they're kind of legally able to do and what they're going to maybe try and try to glean from the data or from their users and stuff. And at the end of the day, if you can track it back to a user, is that any difference than tracking a user ID? I mean, probably not.
Yeah, it's just an anonymous person, but we're being tracked in so many ways. And people who aren't software engineers may not know this. It's just everything you touch as a microchip is tracking. We already lost.
I'm curious about how do consumers care, or do consumers want to think they care and just want to go with the side that they get the idea that, oh, they said they're keeping my stuff safe. I know everyone's tracking me, but they're currently saying they're keeping me safe, so I'm going to go hang out with Apple right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
They care.
It's more down to marketing than anything else. I mean, I do believe Salesforce and marketing do respect that internally, but they're still tracking you and just being very respectful internally about how they use that. They're still making a lot of money off of your actions and analytics.
Well, I, for one, am very glad that the VR space is still early enough that this is not like overwhelming, and that you're not, debating how much of our visual field can be sold to advertisements before introducing.
Definitely. There's a lot of conversations in the standards groups about how to make those things not available to the application developers while still being able to provide the functionality that's there, especially in the web world. It's how do you convince a user that a dialog box about a credit card authorization purchase is valid when you can also have anything render at any time realistically. So it's there's some really interesting conversations about trusted immersive UI that don't have conclusions yet. So
how do you think that crossed with Facebook owning or Meta owning kind of the space in terms of the metaverse right now has impacted VR and kind of where we're at, given that Facebook's maybe from a privacy standpoint been on questionable terms by the general public and stuff, but they're also currently the biggest player in the AR VR space, in terms of hardware.
Yeah, everyone kind of sees them taking getting into AR and VR as a means to also have the platform and the hardware and the device so they don't get shut out like they have been on Apple devices. So it's kind of they want to have that vertical kind of integration across the entire user experience so that they can be able to utilize the information and also provide the world. But I think there's going to be a lot of different devices that come to market that don't require that. That's a big selling point of some non-Meta devices is they're not all owned by one company that's producing the experience too. And I think that's a pretty interesting value add that community folks are speaking out about. I enjoy having a device that's a different company than the company that's producing the experience, just because you know that they're not necessarily tracking you on both sides.
So would you say that Meta is generally in favor of the integration interoperability standards between devices or not?
They are. So I think there's different sections of the company that have different incentives, and there's certainly a part of Meta that is very contributing very heavily to the open standards on both WebXR and OpenXR. So they're doing a lot to contribute, but they have a perverse incentive to have all the information in order to be able to keep their business model working, and their business model is advertising. So it's interesting to think about that incentive.
Perhaps this competitive dynamic could be part of what has inspired Apple to be more interested in the open standards.
Definitely.
Just speculating. Well, gosh, well, I just want to thank everybody for this podcast. It's been a lot of fun speaking with you all about stuff, and I've learned a lot. What did we miss? We covered all these topics, but does anybody want to offer a provocative prediction for 2023 based on what they see ahead that we haven't discussed yet?
I'm counting down the time that we can ask for the plot of the next Bruce Willis film and have it just generate an entire 90-minute video action adventure on demand. But yeah, that aspect of generative is going to be very interesting of how it's going to go. And I've seen generative that makes a 3D in a play through 3D experience that's purely generative, right? And I think that, literally it's just all running on ML hardware. It's not running on 3D hardware anymore. It's going to be very interesting over the next year where that's going to go. But I think that we're going to see that become at least early prototypes within the next 12 months.
I hadn't thought of generative VR experiences until this call. And so now I'm like super excited to see one.
My bold prediction is based on what I'm seeing with ChatGPT, where they got to 1 million users within 3 days. I can't think of any company that was able to do that. And assuming that there's going to be continued innovation over the next year and other companies sort of following in fast follow mode, that space is going to blow up like crypto. It may become overhyped, but it's going to become a huge space. There's already a lot of AI startups, but specifically in this area obviously we're in difficult economic conditions right now, but for any investments happening right now, I think you're going to see just a massive hype cycle in this area. Some of it real, a lot of it real, but a lot of investment. And you'll see a lot of verticals coming out, maybe like education, for example, a lot more ways to use AI to design new courses. You'll see it in healthcare, new ways to in the past, they had this idea of an expert system trying to diagnose what your issue was. I think you'll just see a lot more applications. You'll probably see a lot of failed applications, but you'll see a lot of interesting applications built on this technology, in the next 12 months.
I can't wait to see educational experiences based on kind of a Socratic dialogue with a GPT model, a large language model, just asking questions and explaining things until you're educated on the topic. That sounds awesome.
Sounds more fun than taking the test.
Yeah, that's right. and cramming for a test. Any others?
I think this year is the first year we're going to start to see like augmented reality features and augmented reality wearable user experiences start to really get out there, just because the types of devices that are queued up. There's been a lot of mobile phone AR for quite a while. I think this is the first year where people are going to start to experience more wearable AR because the devices are starting to hit.
Awesome. And I think before the talk, you mentioned maybe indoor and outdoor.
Yeah, Niantic announced a reference design for an outdoor headset. So I'm very excited to go out and play with that. And my use case I'm really interested in is some kind of like physical sport type thing, like a laser tag type experience. I think would be fun to prototype and play with. And there's a controller too. So it's not relying on kind of the hand tracking, which isn't always 100% accurate. So a controller and glasses in a park, all kinds of cool fun stuff. That sounds fun.
Super fun. Can't wait to see the park full of people flailing around.
Totally.
Yeah, my prediction is the continued power of my prediction is the continued power of taking these pro applications and moving them to the web, as well as with Apple kind of supposedly allowing for push notifications. So I think we're going to see a resurgence in mobile web in the next 6 to 12 months as well.
That's interesting.
Awesome. Yeah.
So I look at some macro effects when you think about predictions, and there's some big ones, and this is kind of a little bit off to the side here, but we've reached peak child, right? So there's a finite cap on the number of humans. We're at 7 and change billion right now. We're going to go up to 11 over the next couple of decades. We've also got a climate crisis that's basically here and arriving more with every year. We've got more cheap compute, and that's where you're seeing a lot more of the VR, AR stuff be able to happen. It's basically because computing the models are getting better, right? But the computers become so cheap that it can run in handset. You can do cool outdoor headsets and things like that. And you can do a lot more remote work. So in my mind, humanity's getting kind of to its IPO point. We've been in growth mode where, decades back, it was all about go get valuable land resources and claim them. Now we're still in this mode of claiming stuff, claiming big spaces and you see this in land grabs and massive IPOs of people like Uber. I'm going to go claim that. That's mine, and throw money at it. That I see that as gradually slowing down, and humanity gets into this lovely maintenance mode where it's reached its IPO. The growth phase is somewhat over, and we're looking at what is the best operating system to run humanity, because there's a finite number of people there. We have to attack the climate crisis. That creates opportunity in there to put technology to work to maintain and keep us all alive on this planet, which we now own completely.
Oh, what a fascinating idea, Nico. That's really wonderful. And perhaps when humanity is reached that sort of steady state and less claiming territory and extracting, we can put our attentions to more creative pursuits like prompting generative models to create amazing artwork.
We need to figure out how we get AI to solve climate change for us.
Yeah,
isn't that how dystopias start?
Compute. What's that?
Sorry, isn't that like how the dystopia
Yeah, maybe that's a
starts?
bad idea.
Yeah, if we really hand over the keys, we're in serious trouble.
Just make paper clips. That's all we need.
Yeah. Thanks, guys, so much. It's been a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.